Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Arab Gulf States Institute. My name is Steve Seche, and it's my distinct pleasure to be able to serve as moderator for this discussion this afternoon. And we'll be looking at a critical piece of our national security mosaic, if you will, which is countering violent extremism. And helping us do so, we are very, very fortunate to have two acknowledged experts in the field, and I will introduce them momentarily. I'm very happy to welcome you all here to the conversation, and we'll be looking very carefully at kind of the motivations, if you will, of what makes young people, young men and women, leave their homes and their communities to join the ranks of organizations that are bent on using violence and terror to achieve political ends, what we can do to counter those impulses, and how well we're doing at this. And again, my great pleasure to have with us today in the search for answers to these complicated questions. We have to my far right, Seamus Hughes, who is the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University. Seamus also worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, serving as a lead staffer on U.S. government efforts to implement the national CVE strategy that was announced by President Obama in 2011. And to my immediate right is His Excellency Maqsoud Kruse, who has served since 2012 as the Executive Director of the Abu Dhabi-based Hedayah, the International Center of Excellence for Countering Violent Extremism. And I invite you all to read their bios in their entirety in this handy folder, which I think was probably in front of you when you sat down. Rather than take the time for the discussion to do so, I will leave it at that. And I think what we'll do is talk among ourselves for a bit, maybe 45 minutes or so, and then open up the floor for questions and invite you all to join the conversation with us. And maybe to begin, I think maybe I'll start with you, Maqsoud, if I may, and kind of ask you for a report card, if you will. You know, how are we doing on CVE? Are we making headway? Are we having an effective impact? And how do we measure success? And after that, I'll ask Seamus if you can give it from the U.S. perspective. Sure.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with you today and among many good friends as well. To make it very clear and open and very loud, we have not achieved as much as we should when it comes to understanding the drivers of violent extremism, but also how we can build the necessary mechanisms and also approaches to either prevent and or intervene in order to counter. And what I mean by that is, are we really in a position to measure the percentage of those who identify themselves as sympathizers for certain violent extremist groups actually were able to decide not to join these groups? Were we successful in reducing these percentages? How many actually we can acknowledge or claim to say that our programs actually contributed directly to helping these people not to join these groups or even defect from these groups, more or less. So in a way, I don't want to start by saying, yes, we have major successes and basically we are that close to finish violent extremism. In fact, I hold a very realistic perspective that I don't think even violent extremism will vanish or will finish for a very simple logic. If you ask any criminologist, would we have a society that has zero crime rate? They will tell you this is basically a myth. Unfortunately, it's part of some aspects of the human condition where there'll always be some deviance. And extremism, violence, terrorism is part of that condition. Having said that, though, of course, there are many advancements, and we've seen many progression in the last 5 years, I would say even more than that, since we've introduced the concepts of countering violent extremism, prevention violent extremism, and the different measures that we actually take in this regard. And let me start with the very last part of your question, how we can measure, how we can actually evaluate. In the last couple of months, we at Hedayah, we've actually hosted a couple of meetings to launch a specific application called Masar. And Masar in Arabic means path. And it's a form of an application that you can download on your mobile where it provides you with certain techniques, certain methodologies to help you to collect the data that you want, analyze the data, measure the data to say if my program that I'm implementing on the field is actually working or not. Having said that, though, that's based on variety of social sciences methodologies that can be used. But of course, even that, we are seeing some minor progress in the right direction. The final point I would like to make is that now we are moving forward beyond basically building policies and or theorizing or conceptualizing about what is violent extremism into actually building capacity on the ground in the field where we can see some progression in this regard. My team, for example, a couple of weeks ago just came from Uganda, where they were involved with specific training to specific educationists and teachers from Uganda on education and countering violent extremism as a measure that they can use in the schools and with their different communities. Before that, we had our team from our office in Washington engage in community policing strategies where they're building the national CVE strategies, helping governments, but also officials and practitioners to start building momentum and understanding on how you can connect the dots of all the actors in a given community to work together in the prevention and the intervention in countering violent extremism.
Great, that's a great start, and I think you're right. The metrics are always very complicated, but I do think what you refer to there in terms of building capacity on the ground is something we'd like to get back to in the course of our conversation today. Seamus, your view from here in Washington, please.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you very much for having me at the Arab Gulf States Institute. It's an honor, and it's also an honor to be with you. I've been watching Hedayah kind of grow and becoming this leader and kind of convening all of the different players and thinking through this. And so generally my background is on domestic countering violent extremism. And so looking at why Americans would join terrorist organizations, and thought I'd very quickly give you a very quick overview of how we got to where we are now and where we're at going in the future. So the U.S. has been relatively fortunate in terms of the numbers of individuals that are drawn to violent extremism. So we get about 1,000 active investigations in all 50 states. We've arrested about 160 folks for ISIS-related activities in the last 3 years. It generally pales in comparison to any other Western country. And so with that backdrop, you get a sense that, for the most part, our approach to violent extremism in the U.S. has been a particularly counterterrorism focus, meaning that there were some in government that thought we could actually arrest our way out of this problem if the problem was small enough. I took a different view, and my different view was kind of brought in by interviewing with family members of individuals who joined terrorist organizations and the need to give them different options than simply arrest and doing nothing or watching their kid travel to a conflict zone and perhaps never come back. So in 2011, the Obama administration announced this kind of grand strategy on domestic countering violent extremism. And like any good strategy, it actually had no money attached to it whatsoever. And so when I was in government, it was me and 3 of my friends trying to implement a nationwide program on prevention. And there was 3 pillars of it. One was, let's understand the threat, so let's get good information to state and local officials. And we had a lot, to be frank, some bigoted training that needed to be cleaned up. The second phase of the strategy was enhance our engagement, particularly with Muslim American communities that Al-Qaeda and ISIS were targeting for recruitment. And the third way was countering the propaganda while promoting our ideals. So I'm giving you the overview so you get a sense of it. The strategy, I think most outside viewers would say the strategy's not bad. It makes sense. The devil's always in the details in this, and I think that's where the U.S. government really struggles, is this implementation. You talked about moving away from just strategies to actually having programs on the ground. For the most part, in the U.S. context, domestic countering violent extremism is a story of fits and starts, of intense focus by the White House and a White House summit on it, and then moving on to the next shiny thing the next month. And so I think the only way we're going to get to real prevention efforts is if we actually roll up our sleeves and have resources against it. Right now, we're in a transition period. So at its height in 2015 timeframe, we had about 50 folks in government that were doing this full-time domestically on countering violent extremism, doing what I used to do, which is go to a mosque or community center, talking to Muslim American communities about individuals that are trying to recruit their kids, right? Right now, we're at about 12 people. So the staff's been relatively decimated on this. So it raises the question, this great question about metrics actually matters a great deal. So if you want to go back to Congress and say, I need another $10 million to do this, Congress is going to say, show me that it works. And that's where I think the Trump administration's moving to. They've gone away from the idea of countering violent extremism. They now call it terrorism prevention, which is countering violent extremism, just with a different name, to be fair. And they're focusing primarily away from broad-based engagement. So I used to, 3 girls in Denver jump on a plane to try to go to Syria. They get turned around in Frankfurt because their father calls every phone number in the phone book until he finds a TSA agent, and they send them back. After that happens, the imam of the mosque calls me and says, Seamus, can you talk to my congregation about the next 3 girls and try to prevent them? You go out to Denver, you have a meeting with 300 people in a room, and you try to start a conversation, right? I felt good about it. The surveys were pretty good, but that's not my target demographic, actually, right? The folks that are coming to the mosque to hear an intelligence officer speak is not the folks I need to reach when it comes to individuals drawn to ISIS. So the Trump administration, I think, rightly recognized that this kind of broad-based engagement, while important to lay the groundwork, is not the be-all, end-all. And so they've transitioned primarily to one-on-one interventions. I got a young man I'm worried about. He's starting to talk about how great ISIS is. What are the mental health professionals, social workers, educational officials, mentors I can bring around him to try to bring him back into the fold? And that's really going to be determining whether the metrics are success. Can you close an FBI investigation by not arresting a kid, a 17-year-old kid who talks about how much ISIS is great? Can you actually try a different way? And so this is where this fits and starts is happening right now. And I think there was a temporary time when the Trump administration came in. For about a year, they took a hard review. Now they've done the review, and now they're getting into the business of actually trying to implement.
Fascinating. And I think we'll also take a look at some of the issue of like predictive behavior and what we see in terms of symptoms that we think will translate into actual violent extremism, because I think it's a fascinating subject as well. But Maqsoud, back to you for a minute on this issue of community engagement. There's something of a contradiction or a conflict here, because you're going into communities, you're trying to work with them, and at the same time, there's a lot of suspicion being cast on the members of that same community. So how do you get a community to see itself as a partner and not just a suspect?
Well, basically, the default position that we have, if we're all true and sincere about countering violent extremism, where we're all part of the solution. Therefore, you can't expect that only security forces or government officials carry on this mission, but we need everyone to be part of this as well. From our perspective, for example, at Hedayah, some of the work that we've done included, for example, working with imams in the mosques. Basically, we are approaching them as community leaders, those who can identify at early stage, for example, those who might be vulnerable, and also how they can actually work with them. We work with Afghani imams, Sudanese imams, in order to support them and help them to identify any vulnerable individuals, but also how to build their own programs and intervene. At the same time, we realize that communities include women, families, they're all part of the process as well. Therefore, we develop certain toolkits in this regard, but also engage in certain projects that will allow such engagements to take place and empower the different community actors to be part of this. For us to be working effectively with the community needs to own the challenge and needs to be part of the process, not to be alienated or that they're perceived as basically redundant or useless and not able to contribute in any possible way. At the same time, realizing that for us to keep the community engaged, we need to find mechanisms, pathways, give them opportunities to basically take part on this. And for example, one of the projects that we worked on, and maybe I would like to highlight one of my colleagues and friends, Sarah Saeed, who used to be our program manager at Hedayah, and it was during that time, we worked, for example, with certain social media entities where we identified specific community leaders in the social media world who, leading on entertainment, have fantastic leads and followers, but then we approached them saying to them, instead of you using your sort of social media stardom for entertainment, and nothing wrong with that, can we use this actually to start working on certain campaigns or develop certain concepts in which the community can be involved? And one specific outcome in which Facebook was actually involved in this was one girl in specific. She was from Lebanon, from a Shiite background, where she basically developed a simple video calling another friend of hers, saying to her, well, could you come and pray with me in my Shiite mosque? And a Sunni girl actually responded saying, I'm happy to do that. This experiment inspired another individual in Egypt who actually invited another Egyptian, telling him, you being a Christian Egyptian, would you pray with me in my mosque, and vice versa. This is how you get the community engaged, by making them involved, allowing pathways, but also certain initiatives that will help them to contribute to this.
It's such a wonderfully rich subject, and we already got off into another area that I'm going to pursue, which is the idea of messaging and how that can be effective. Because in our country, we've had a lot of kind of sad history in terms of government involvement in messaging, and it gets kind of, it just gets to be dismissed because it's just government gobbledygook. And so how do we get to Seamus so we do have authentic voices out there speaking and delivering the messages that we think are important, but don't taint the messenger?
Yeah, that's a very good question. A lot of it's framing, right? If you've been watching kind of European and American counter-violent extremism programs, you've seen a shift in the recent years. Back in the day, and I'm pretty good at it, I can rattle off the numbers of individuals who got arrested for terrorism charges. I can tell you the percentage that attacked military bases or were interested in traveling abroad and all of that. I just watched most of your eyes glaze over, right? The difference on how you do this is you talk about stories, right? So, my name is Seamus Hughes. In 2009, I went to Minneapolis. I met with 5 mothers in a basement across the street from the Brian Coyle Rec Center. Those 5 mothers' sons had joined al-Shabaab. Let me tell you the story of Burhan Hassan. Burhan Hassan was 3 years old when he left Somalia. He spent 4 years in a Kenyan refugee camp. His formative years in Minneapolis, wanted to go to Harvard, had this idea of a better Somalia because his mother had talked about Somalia and how great it was before the Troubles. He wanted to build a better Somalia. He's watching videos at the computer lab with his friends, and al-Shabaab's telling him, let's build a better Somalia. So he disappears on election day of 2008. He goes to Kenya. He takes a bus to al-Shabaab, realizes what al-Shabaab had told him was a lie, calls his uncle and says, they lied to me. They're not building a better Somalia. They realize he has doubts, put a bullet in the back of his head, and his family finds out he's killed by looking at Somali websites. My name is Seamus Hughes. I'm a father of 2, and I want to save the next Burhan Hassan. Will you help me? Right? At some point in those few years when Burhan was in Minneapolis, he was showing signs of radicalization, or he was having doubts. And at some time, when you look at the studies, at least 60% of a bystander effect. People understand that something's off. They don't really know what they're watching, but they know they're watching a train wreck, right? And so the framing does matter a bit. It's not about stopping the next terrorist attack. It's about saving these kids, right? Of course, there's going to be individuals that deserve the full tonnage of the counterterrorism and military apparatus, right? If you grab an AK-47 and you join a foreign terrorist organization, there are going to be consequences. But at some point, I don't want to be in a room with 5 grieving mothers talking about how to prevent them, right? And once they get on a plane, there's very little I can do. So will you help me get them on the front end? That is actually how you get an audience to care, right? And the point of framing is to get someone to raise their hand and say, okay, I don't want another Burhan. I'm willing to help. It actually doesn't matter in the messenger, for the most part, I think, right? There is something powerful about a white Irish Catholic talking about how profiling doesn't work, right? There is something powerful about an intelligence officer standing up and saying, I'm actually worried about kids. That's a message in and of itself. But the message actually matters a great deal, as much as the messenger.
Maqsoud, any thoughts about the effectiveness of messaging from where you're watching it be delivered?
Sorry. I'll just share with you a very simple story. It happened actually in New York a few years ago. I was attending a speech. And a gentleman from a security agency, I'll not mention which one, was talking about how social media is being used to recruit people and also push them in the wrong direction. He took his mobile and said, what is this? This is not a phone, this is a weapon. And he was talking about how we need to shut down websites, etc. When he finished, I picked a pen that was on the table and I said, with all due respect, sir, I will shove this pen in your eyes. So let's ban all pens on the world. And I said, basically, the idea was not in the technology or in the platform or the medium of communication. The real question is this: when they produce their messages, why it resonates with some of our youth and it doesn't resonate with others, why it's more influential with some and not influential with others. And basically, it's the kind of vacuum that we have today in terms of what kind of content, what kind of alternative that we need to do. And frankly, this whole business of counter messaging, I personally am not in favor of. I'm not in favor of any counter of any sort, because I believe in moving forward. In the ideal world that I would love to see when it comes to how we can have effective counter messaging is that we initiate the process, we develop the message, we set the tone, we set the stage, and we launch the messages and let them counter our messages, not the other way around. Basically, what is happening that we have a vacuum at the moment, and they show you all these atrocities happening in the world or the political grievances, and basically they tell you, we need to make a difference. Would you join us? And it'll be easy for you to join these groups. On the other side, what we, the good guys, actually are doing, and how charismatic, how influential are we in this sort of a process. To give you two examples of how we do this at Hedayah, early this year, actually, we've invited and hosted two types of interesting early last year. I'm losing sense of time. Basically, two interesting groups of former violent extremists. The first group, we had a combination of right-wing and Islamists and other forms. The second group was women defectors, former violent extremists. And what we did is we asked them two simple questions. A, why did you join these groups in the first place? The second question, how did you actually snap out of it? And basically, we used the experience of communications and media to map their experiences. So we started at the cognitive level, what they were thinking through this process, and then at the emotional level, what did they feel through that process, and then at the behavioral level, how did they evolve and change from being into the position of vulnerability and wanting to join these groups, all the way to actually snapping out of it and deciding to fight these groups. And by mapping these experiences, we have a better understanding of this. Also, we've done something similar. We went to Indonesia and worked on a specific manual, specific guide on Southeast Asia, and have done the same with the Middle East, where we basically ask the people and try to understand why certain messages, why certain narratives actually affect you and make you move into that direction. But to be frank with you, most of the effort is focused on the mediums, on the social media, on the platform. But frankly, I think where the effort should be is on the message itself. What is it that we're presenting for our youth as an alternative method? You see, when the Syrian conflict actually started, at some point of its peak, there were some clips that were actually very popular at the time within the Arabic-speaking world, where you see the masses, the people, going out in the streets chanting in Arabic, "Wainak ya Allah," God, where are you? Because of all the killing, or because of all the atrocities they had to go through. And the answer was Daesh. They showed up, said, you know what, we are the answer, we will save the day. And here we are. So the absence of an alternative and inability to fill the vacuum in a way contributed to their narrative and messaging. And we need to move beyond just reflecting or responding or answering what they're producing to actually lead on the direction that we need to take.
And Seamus, is that your sense that here in the United States, with our own government, we are moving away from this kind of counter-messaging? Because I think Maqsoud makes a fair point.
Yeah, I think in the U.S. context, it's not that we're moving away. We were never there. If you look at domestic counter-messaging or alternative messaging in the U.S. context for Americans, there's nobody playing the space. Department of Homeland Security doesn't have staff to do that. State Department does not focus on counter-messaging or alternative messaging to Americans for a variety of different legal and other policy reasons. And so because of that, and because there's no money attached to counter-violent extremism, nobody's risen up to do it. And so the default, I think, we've seen in both in government and on Capitol Hill is what I think one could argue is essentially a lazy approach to this, which is just entirely on takedown. So we've largely ceded an inherently governmental response or responsibility of counter-messaging and alternative messaging to private companies and saying take down content. Well, that only goes so far. I mean, violent content is one thing, and violent extremism, but we're forgetting about the extremism part. And so if you want to kind of go after the ideological underpinnings, somebody's going to have to play in that space. And right now, you're not having it. I would say there's a few easy fixes on this. So when I was in government, I was in Sacramento one time, and we had done a big event, and I was hanging out with an imam of the local mosque there, pretty large mosque. And after 4 or 5 hours of arguing back and forth about FBI techniques and terrorism and stuff like that, we finally got to a good place. And he said, Seamus, I actually believe you on this. I'm worried about ISIS, and actually I'm worried particularly about Anwar al-Awlaki, and I'd like to do counter-messaging on that. And I said, sir, that is phenomenal. I'm really glad I took a red eye to get here. And he said, well, I'm gonna record myself, and I'm gonna post it on YouTube. I said, sir, nobody's gonna watch that. It's going to be an hour of you lecturing behind a white screen. You're going to get 3 views, right? I'll tell you what. I'm in government. I can play the role of convener. So let me connect you with the folks at YouTube and Facebook and other places that can tag your videos. They pop up on Anwar al-Awlaki video when you search for Anwar al-Awlaki, or that can cut it down to the 3.5 minutes that we know by studies are the longest someone's ever going to watch it. And let's figure out a way to do this, right? So the government can play a role of convener, of working with the Facebooks of the world, of the big four, right? The other bureaucratic easy fix we could do is, when I talk to a lot of folks that want to do alternative messaging in this space. Let me take a step back. In my research, I interview a lot of guys and gals who join terrorist organizations, are in ISIS and come out, right? I understand the risks involved in that. I have a full understanding of what the material support to terrorism clause is. I understand I'm probably going to get secondaried at the airport for the rest of my life. I've accepted that as a realization, right? I don't think it's fair to ask a community member to take those same types of risks, to engage with a known or suspected terrorist and communicate with them over a course of a few months to try to convince them to not join a terrorist organization, and as a result, perhaps ping against kind of legal concerns and, frankly, kind of no-fly concerns, right? So if we lock a bunch of lawyers in a room and take away lunch for about 2 or 3 hours, I think we could figure out a way to get a 2 or 3 page memo that said, here's the right and left lines for what you can do online for counter messaging, here's the local field office you can talk to, and here's a few philanthropic organizations that are willing to fund you, and go out and do it. We just need to lower the bar. People want to do this, right? They feel a need to be involved in this. We just haven't allowed for the ease of access to get into the space.
Great. Thank you, Seamus. All right, now that we've gotten warmed up a little bit, I want to get to what to me is maybe the thorniest question on this issue, which is that of motivation. And we talked a little bit about, specific cases and what we see in terms of what motivates people. But, is it social alienation? Is it religious conviction? Is it economic hardship? Is it, altruism? In your research and your experience, have you been able to kind of come up with a set of indicators that says to you, whoops, red flag, big alarm, this person is going to go down the wrong path?
The one rule that we have, that there is no rule. And the ultimate challenge that we have is how you actually profile a potential violent extremist, whether male or female, that doesn't exist at the moment. The reason is because the phenomena that we're dealing with is so complex, and we don't fully understand it yet, in my personal opinion. And therefore, to identify specific variables, specific factors as the direct cause why someone becomes violent extremist is extremely problematic. Some would like to fall into this simplistic dichotomy. So they would say, for example, if you are poor, you're a terrorist. Or they say if you're illiterate, you're a terrorist. Or they say if you're religious, you're a terrorist. Well, how you explain, for example, Osama bin Laden comes from a filthy rich background. How you explain Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's an MD trained to save people, he doesn't do that anymore. And how you explain people like, for example, Yusuf Islam, formerly Cat Stevens, he converted, he became Muslim, but he still holds his guitar as he calls his last book. Therefore, having these simplistic approaches is problematic in itself. We're dealing with a multidimensional phenomena where there are several conditions, several variables that actually deal with that and contribute to this and why someone becomes vulnerable. But obviously, there are what we call pull and push factors. There are certain variables that will contribute to why someone become more vulnerable and most likely moving into that sort of path. But most interesting, what are the conditions why someone who already been through the process of violent extremism actually snaps out of it? What's the antidote? What makes someone actually move out of this? For me, that was most interesting question than why people actually go there. And in fact, in some of the work that we've done, you'll have a variety of reasons. People will talk about perceived political grievances, all the way to personality and preferences and social factors related to their upbringing or their own conditions, and in between many variations. But the question that remains, those who actually went through the process, what was their calling? What is it that made them actually wake up and realize that they didn't have to go through this process? And frankly, some people would say psychopathology plays roles. Some people would say certain economic drivers. Some people would say it's actually multi-layered. I recall, for example, some of our team members who went to Bosnia and maybe interviewed certain individuals. They have the look that they were religious extremists. They have all the usual features, the facial expressions, the beard, the religious sort of rhetoric. But then when you dig deep, you realize it's simply poverty. They didn't have money and they wanted to have alternative. Others, on the other hand, they simply join these groups because of one simple universal human value, justice. They want to make a difference, they want to contribute, and they're simply angry and they want to do something. When people feel they're limited and they can't contribute, they can't make any difference, they basically snap and they feel they have to contribute in a different way as well. And you can't stop people from expressing their need to this. I think what is really needed is that regardless of the different variables and different maybe reasons and conditions that maybe create the environmental processes for someone to go through this, what is it that we can do to mitigate? What is it that we can do to prevent, to stop this from actually happening? So if you want to contribute, for example, to the Syrian cause, there are non-violent approaches to this. There are different ways of supporting. There are different ways of still making you feel good about yourself that you're trying to contribute, but not necessarily by killing innocent people, or even worse, by actually reaching a point where you blow up yourself because you think that's the way you need to go there.
Seamus.
Yeah, just add a few things. People usually get mad at academics when the question is, what are the profile of a terrorist, and the answer is there's no profile of a terrorist. That's actually a result of research, not despite it, right? And so there is, just looking at the American scene, right? You can be old, young, rich, poor, black, white, integrated, isolated, and everything in between. Male, female, it doesn't really matter. There's not a method to the madness when it comes to a profile. There's not a typical profile of an ISIS recruit. There are kind of some reoccurring themes. So for the American ISIS folks, the earlier cases were much more drawn to this idea of justice that we talked about, right? This idea of the Assad atrocities, the barrel bombs, the food lines, the stuff that we saw in the nightly news every day. The later cases, which was the majority of the Americans after that, it was this kind of perceived, and I use the word perceived, religious obligation for a so-called caliphate. So the fact that Baghdadi announced what he did was a driver for a lot of our folks. Now you can kind of plug and play on the person depending on the case. So some individuals are purely kind of violence seekers. They want to watch the world burn and are interested in doing the horrible things we see online. A good number of them are actually drawn to this idea of building a utopian society. Electricity in Mosul and candy out to kids in Raqqa. But I should note that humans by their very nature are complex, and the reason why you join terrorist organizations are varied, and also the reasons why you leave terrorist organizations are varied. And it's also not limited to just one form of extremism. So I don't know if you guys are like me and track white nationalist movements for fun, but we, this morning, the Traditional Workers Socialist Party, which is the guys that were features on the front page of the New York Times a while back, they got about 1,000 members in Indiana and Ohio. Last night, they completely imploded. And the reason they imploded were purely personal reasons. The leader had an affair with the wife of the deputy. And so the deputy then deleted all of their websites and all their contacts, and now they're fighting back and forth online, right? That is not a de-radicalization success story. The guy is still a white nationalist.
It's an organizational success story.
Right, but it's a disengagement success story. And we have to kind of be okay with it. I mean, I think back to one of bin Laden's bodyguards quits, and the reason why, because he found out the other bodyguard was making $10 more a month. Sometimes it's personal reasons, sometimes it's ideological, sometimes it's a lot of those things. And so the hope is that you can plug and play depending on the individual. So you build a profile of the person, you say, I know what makes them tick, and this is what I think will help get them back into the mainstream. So I think back, I interviewed a British guy who was in ISIS for a while. He was in Fallujah, and we're going back and forth on some app I won't talk about. And we were going back and forth for a couple of months. He was, jabbing me and talking about how great ISIS was. I was ignoring him and going back and forth. I knew he was a convert. So on Easter Sunday, I reached out to him. I said, have you reached out to your mother and checked in and let her know you're alive? Well, he blocked me for 3 days. I realized at that point I had a touch point, right? He had a level of guilt about the fact that he left his mom and dad behind, right? That took me 3 or 4 months to figure out what made that kid tick, right? I'm not going to save a guy in Fallujah and bring him back to the UK, right? But the hope is if you have a 17-year-old kid in Cardiff, you could be able to do that, right? That is very labor intensive to figure out and kind of essentially do a psychological profile on these individuals. It takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of training, but more importantly for the U.S. government, it would take a level of political will that I'm not sure is there, right? So think back to the State Department doing counter messaging or alternative messaging, right? For about 6 or 7 years, they did it in about 6 languages on forums. Everyone loved what they did in the intelligence community. They got a mandate from for the Obama White House to do counter messaging in English. They then did that and set up a Twitter page and did a video. All of a sudden, the Washington Post could read their counter messaging because it's in English, right? At that point, there was a front page story about how bad the counter messaging was, right? It was bad, let's be honest, right? But there's going to be a level of trial and error that you need to build into these type of programs, that you have to have the political backing to do so. You have to know that if you try to do an intervention on 100 people and it's successful 99 of the times, but that one time that individual goes on an unfortunate attack in a mall, the program can withstand that. And that takes a level of political capital that I'm not sure we're there yet.
Maqsoud, on the issue of kind of community engagement, I guess, maybe I'm wrong, but a lot of the programs that have been run for at-risk youth, if you will, have an association or run by or managed by law enforcement agencies of one sort or another. Even if they're trying to be benign about their association with it, there is a sense that this is the government coming in and imposing its will again. Is that the case? And if so, how do you get around that sense of the government still inserting itself in my life in some negative way?
Well, it's embedded in Hedayah's organizational DNA that we actually were created part of the Global Counterterrorism Forum, where there was a realization that relying on military, security, policing approaches alone is no longer enough. And basically in our work, we realize that if you present something as a government only, you basically lose on the wider community and getting everyone actually involved in this process. Parents are part of the solution. Educators are part of the solution. Media people are part of the solution. Basically, all community leaders, civil society are part of the solution for a very simple reason, because we don't yet fully understand what makes somebody actually tick in that sort of direction. If we take one specific case study, if we talk about John the Jihadist, the famous guy whose name was Muhammad Amwazi, according to media reports, this guy started as being someone who belongs to a specific category in Kuwait called Budun, those who don't have citizenship pre-modern state in Kuwait. So they don't have official documents and they can't prove they were actually living here or they just smuggled themselves in. During that process, the father actually applied for immigration to the UK. They were granted that, and they left. During his time at the school, for example, you could see this sort of evolution, his own sort of development, where he started as a very shy person, always hiding behind masks. He can't even speak to the girl that he fell in love with. And then later on, he started developing certain tendencies, going into rapping, hip-hopping, drugs, enjoying nightlife. And suddenly he bumps into some people who were influenced by the Shababs in Somalia. And this was his first encounter, and he became part of that process. Until one of his friends who recruited him, when they went to Somalia, were killed by the Shababs themselves, and he went through this phase of disillusionment. And during that time, security agencies tried to approach him, they tried to work with him, tried to interrogate, and there was this organization called Cage where they reported that he actually complained to them that he wanted to commit suicide because they don't allow him to leave the UK, they don't allow him to go through a proper process of finding a job or even wanting to work somewhere else. And then the Syrian situation happened, and his excuse to leave was he wanted to join the humanitarian effort. The next thing you know, he became this jihadist, and he actually joined the groups that later become Daesh, and then he evolved to become this executioner. Now, if you look in his sort of own story and the different phases he went through, in every single phase, there was a role for a different person, for a different entity, for a different organization to maybe intervene as early as possible to stop this person not going through becoming this monster that we've seen and all the bareheading he's actually committed. And even worse, when you look at the footage and some of the reports, when he was socializing among other Daesh operatives, when he's not wearing the mask, he seems to be a very friendly, quiet, nice person. Even the processes of how he used to commit the bareheading, the scenarios he used to do, it's very professional and very cruel to the way that you don't think that someone like him actually would be able to do that level of atrocity, all in the name of certain narrative and certain ideological drivers. Therefore, obviously, the community plays a very important role, but not only as government, because that will always be ineffective, will always be perceived as a way of intervening, controlling. And frankly, violent extremism, in my personal opinion, is not an issue for governments only. We have to share the burden. It's an issue of all of us. If we recall a few years ago, there were 3 girls from the UK who decided to be Daesh brides. You know, they wanted to join these groups. They were teenagers, and frankly speaking, as a teenager, to say that they had this deep ideological conviction is in a way problematic, because this assumes that they've read every single holy book on the planet, they read every single religious discourse, and they made this rational decision that this is the true path to paradise. I want to be a wife of a jihadist. But it was more a combination of emotional, psychological processes and also perceived grievances and other factors. The question is this: while they were in the process of thinking and developing their feeling and emotion and intent to join these groups, if they had the opportunity to have a conversation with someone they trusted, a parent, a teacher, an imam, even a colleague, a senior person who would be able to talk to them and talk them actually out of this, maybe providing them with alternatives of how they can still be passionate about the Syrian cause, how they can still contribute, but not actually lose their lives because of that, I would argue maybe we would have a different outcome. And even if we go back a little bit, the Mujahideen of the Afghani Arabs, the pre-Qaeda, the Osama bin Laden group, basically, if you look at the processes in which they went through their own radicalization process and the different opportunities that were given to maybe help them to reintegrate and maybe address some of the grievances or maybe perceptions they had, maybe, again, we would have avoided having the Osama bin Laden that we know, the killer, the criminal that we are all aware of.
Maqsoud, you mentioned just now the 3 girls from the UK, and Seamus, you mentioned earlier the 3 girls from Denver who wanted to go. That's right, Shabab. My question is the girls and young women being drawn into the radicalization, is that a phenomenon that you see growing? Is it a concern? And does it require a different approach to de-radicalization than it is when you're dealing with young men? Maybe I'll ask Seamus to start and then go to Maqsoud.
Sure. If you can answer the solving the problem, I'll do what the problem is. That seems easier to me. No, in the U.S. context, you have seen an increasing number of women drawn to jihadist groups. So in the U.S., again, about 159 folks arrested for terrorism charges. About 12 to 13 women have been arrested in that data set. Small compared to the larger data set, but significant nonetheless. I would have a few points on it. You know, at the program in Extremism, we have tracked about 1 million ISIS English language tweets for the last year and a half. About 700 plus ISIS Telegram channels. We have a team of very eager interns that go through this. And what you see is the role of women in these terrorist organizations is not what you would assume, I think, you know, reading media, right? So they're playing active roles in it. In many ways, they're facilitators for it. One of the key English language ISIS facilitators online was a woman named Safi Yassin from Missouri, who was connected to a bunch of different folks online and was plugging and playing men to go join the conflict. And so they're playing the role of convener in a way that you hadn't seen. I should also note, and I think this is probably the most important thing, the research hasn't caught up with the way we view it as a society. So if you look at the charging and the sentencing of men who join terrorist organizations versus women who join terrorist organizations, on average, men get about 16 years. On average, in the U.S., women get about 10 years. And judges use the words like brainwashing and there's no agency and they're going to be jihadi brides, which there are some, of course, some of that plays out. But they also don't recognize that I think women have their own agency on this issue and make a full decision to join a foreign terrorist organization. And so I worry when we determine to do countering violent extremism programs that we try to tailor it too much towards one gender. I'm not sure that has to be the be-all, end-all. That said, I may, depending on the audience, I may use a different approach. Maybe it's not me that does it, but my colleague Jenny that talks to a crowd of Somali mothers about these issues. Right? It just depends on the issue.
Great, thank you, Maqsoud.
No solutions there, so
Yeah.
good luck.
He left it
Nor,
wide open
nor,
for
nor,
Maqsoud.
nor I claim that there is.
No, Steve can do it.
In fact, we've worked 2 years ago on a project that we were criticized about, basically the role of women in violent extremism, because at the time when Daesh at the peak of bareheading, people were telling us, you're going soft. In fact, and unfortunately, we started to see immediately in the last 1 year and a half or 2 years in the separate incidences you've seen in Europe, that there was always a female element in the process. And usually you see their roles in certain categories. Number one is obviously recruitment. They're very good and successful in that. Incitement, basically supporting and encouraging these kind of atrocities. Financing, where they carry the money, they make sure they smuggle the money as much as they can, but also operating as being themselves operatives and also carrying on certain attacks. Having said that, though, the work that we've done and the publication we've made, A Man's World, basically looking at the different drivers why female operatives actually join these groups and why they become part of it, shows us that there is a tendency, especially within the Daesh phenomenon, where they started to approaching not only young men but also women. They look at all kinds of opportunities to infiltrate the family system, and also through women, through their role as mothers, to play a more role in the killing, in the harm of other innocent people. The program we've done on the mapping of the experience of the female defectors, former female defectors, basically shows you, again, that there's a tendency there that there's recruitment for women, and therefore there's a certain level of vulnerability. One group that is famous for doing this, obviously, is Boko Haram in Nigeria, where they systematically kidnap and abduct women and go through a certain process of recruitment, but also using them in certain incidences. And we've seen 2 years ago, for example, one of the ladies that were kidnapped actually made them pregnant, and then she has her own little baby, where she uses this as a cover-up, as a camouflage to commit a suicide attack in the middle of a market in Nigeria. Last year, when we started seeing the advancement in Mosul on the ground, and the sort of civilians started fleeing out, one of the incidences that took place was one of the women who were leaving, they assumed she was an innocent civilian, but in fact she was also a Daesh operative who had a bomb in her bag and also carrying her baby. The plan was to blow up ourselves at the checkpoint, but for a technical problem that did not happen, and unfortunately the bomb took off once she moved beyond the checkpoint. So the bottom line is, groups, for example, like Daesh and others, they would recruit everyone as much as they can, even young children, young women, older men, older women, even entire families. And we've seen this specifically with Daesh. They had this strong appeal and also the ability to bring these people on board. Therefore, I believe they will continue to use all kinds of resources, and of course women will continue to be part of this. Having said that, though, also, women play a very positive, strong role to reverse this process. And I think this is, again, part of the alternative approach to countering violent extremism, by seeing how they can play such a role. Last year or the year before, there was an incident in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, for example. Twin brothers who were radicalized and recruited by Daesh stabbed their mother to death when she was praying, because she continued to condemn them and telling them that joining Daesh is un-Islamic in itself. Yet she paid her life as a price for continuing that sort of process. Therefore, this kind of dynamic will continue, and we need to explore more opportunities in this regard.
Great, thank you. And with that, let me open up the conversation to as many of you as would like to participate. If you want to raise your hand, I'll recognize you. Please identify yourselves, if you'd be so kind, and ask a question following that, and we can proceed. Yeah, Horacio's right here, please. Mary will come up with a microphone.
Thank you.
Hello, Horatio Ureta, formerly Department of State. More directed for Maqsoud. You know, we talk about extremism, we tend to view it as, you know, effectively terrorism against the West. You know, given that you're in the UAE and you've been around the region, how much of this extremism is based on or affecting the intra-Muslim Sunni-Shia divide? How much of that do you see as extremism either fueling it or resulting in it?
Thank you. Our work at Hedayah, as a general comment, we focus on all forms of violent extremism, left, right, Islamic, non-Islamic, in the region and beyond. So we work with groups like the FARC in Colombia, all the way to Abu Sayyaf in Mindanao in the Philippines. But to be more specific, within the Islamic regional context specifically, the main narrative that was driving most of these groups, and as Seamus actually also referred to, which was related to certain narratives related to the end of days stories and in a way sort of a mythology. If you look at Daesh's own publication, they used to have something called Dabik, and by the way, it used to be sold on, I think, Amazon or something at some point, but somebody discovered that it shouldn't be there. Exactly. But you see, the word Dabik refers to a certain area in Syria that certain scripture sayings of the Prophet refers to the end of days big sort of Armageddon and confrontation, where the battle between the true forces of God against the true forces of Satan or Antichrist will happen. And Daesh always projected themselves as the ones who are going to take that battle to the very end. And that is something they carried on from Al-Qaeda, where Daesh actually came out from. And that's part of a certain narrative related to their views. The Shia-Sunni part, to be frank, in my personal assessment, did not play much in the creation of the anti-West sentiment, especially within these groups. So even Al-Qaeda, when it was created, Al-Qaeda means database in Arabic, and that was the name that was given to them as a branding. But their official name was always that they were the global front against the Crusades and the Jews. That was their main intent. And the main narrative, especially of Al-Qaeda, أخرجوا المشركين من جزيرة العرب, take all the infidels out of the Arabic Peninsula, with no reference necessarily to the Shias. And in fact, some reports even indicated that some of Osama bin Laden's children, including Hamza, who might be the next sort of leader in Al-Qaeda, actually was raised and grew up in Iran, which is very much dominant with Shiites. Having said that, though, within the sort of Islamic radical groups, they manage to prioritize in terms of what they perceive as the near enemy versus the far enemy. What is the immediate urgency that they have to engage with, and what is actually the more distant one. But I would argue that the Sunni Shiite sort of dynamics in that context did not play much within that radicalization. In fact, what you see is more sympathy, and in many ways maybe a hidden coordination because of the camps of those who perceive themselves as Islamists versus non-Islamists, those who share similar agenda, similar view. They all want khilafah at the end of the day. They all believe that they have to dominate. They all believe that the West is conspiring against them. And they have a broad definition of the West. So it's not just the typical, for example, Europe, United States, or Australia or others, but also those who are not part of their ideology or don't subscribe to their own narrative. But certainly the Muslim internal dynamics within the Sunni Shiite, and that's only one dynamic. There are also other dynamics within the different schools of thought within Sunni Islam, different schools of thoughts within the Shiite Islam. And Islam is not only the Sunni and Shiite, but you have other groups also on the side. So where you put Sufis, for example, on this ongoing internal dynamics have been going on for some time and most likely will continue, but it was always part of the diversity and richness of the Islamic culture. The question is why it exploded in the last 50 to 80 years, not before that.
Great, thank you so much. A question right here.
Yes, thank you very much for a most interesting panel. I'm Sarah Saeed from the State Department, and my question is to both Seamus and Maqsoud. Thank you for sharing with us some interesting interventions. You mentioned that they're quite labor-intensive, both from the community perspective, as well as engaging community leaders, psychologists, among others. And of course, in an era of diminishing government resources, I wonder if you could mention or highlight a couple of places where these interventions have become sustainable by their own communities, where they've been able to take on those interventions and make them their own.
All right, let's start with Seamus, and we'll go to Maqsoud.
Yeah, in the U.S. context, not a whole lot. In Denver, after those three girls jumped on a plane, actually that did shift the conversation. And there has been a pretty serious and sustained effort to create an intervention program, not only for Islamist-inspired terrorism, but also in Colorado you have a pretty significant sovereign citizen population. And so looking at that in terms of interventions, for the most part here, not a whole lot. It's going to be interesting in the next year, though, because the administration finally released $10 million in grant funding to domestic non-governmental organizations to do countering violent extremism. There was some back and forth on that. About $1 million was originally awarded and then turned back because Muslim American groups did not want to be associated with President Trump's rhetoric. And there was a sustained civil rights and civil liberties organizations that have told people don't do CVE. They find it icky, right, for a variety of different reasons, some legitimate, some not. And so now you finally got the grant money out. The issue right now is the Trump administration has focused the grants on it has to be a connection to a law enforcement organization too. And so that's going to raise these kind of questions we brought up before, which is how closely can you be tied to government, and does that make you more effective or not? The one asterisk on this is, to be frank, I don't see the FBI ever giving up a case to a non-governmental organization and saying, you now have the case file, go out and de-radicalize this young man, because if that young man does something horrible, they're the ones who are standing in front of Congress explaining what happened. And that is going to be the push and pull, at least for the foreseeable future.
Maqsoud.
Thank you, Sarah, for your excellent question. There's a gap that we identify between the civil society, NGOs, community leaders, and also leading individuals, how they can sustain their own initiatives in terms of how to best counter violent extremism. Funding is important, but alone is not enough, because at the end of the day, if you don't have credible voices, if you don't have initiatives from within the community, it'll be very difficult to sustain. For example, we worked with countries such as Jordan, where basically they had their own internal processes in which they have their own support. So their main center for countering extremism, for example, is part of their Ministry of Culture. So they shifted away from the security mindset in terms of how to intervene and have this more as part of Ministry of Culture and Youth being a community-driven, a community process where other stakeholders can actually intervene and be part of this. We have in the UAE, for example, certain entities such as the Council of Muslim Elders, where basically it focuses on the role of Muslim leaders around the world who can actually contribute both Sunni and Shiite on this council, who can actually create certain initiatives within the Islamic community to work on these sort of issues and not necessarily only relying on funding per se. And most importantly, to be very frank, I think relying only on funding for specific programs and projects, I mean, it has a certain cycle that will end and will finish. But the impact, that's the most important question, how we can make sure that we have the maximum impact, and impact that can actually continue. And this can only be through empowering civil society, NGOs, but also bringing the private sector maybe more interested, more involved to see the value in this sort of contribution. If you look, for example, other humanitarian causes, you'll always see some sort of sympathy towards that. Issues of poverty, certain diseases, certain social issues. You'll find people sympathizing and wanting to move forward and support. But when it comes to countering extremism, violent extremism, terrorism, whatever you want to call it, you'll always have reluctance, and you always have people maybe thinking twice before donating or contributing or wanting to carry this because of the security nature of these issues, the heavy involvement of governments and government agencies, but also the lack of clarity. What is it that we are talking about here? And where do we draw the line between someone being actually an extremist moving towards an act of terrorism, or someone simply being so different and so radical in their own way and just simply eccentric, but they pose no harm to others. And that's part of the ongoing dynamics. However, I think the more efforts towards empowering civil society, NGOs, and maybe creating ownership by individuals maybe will help to solve this sort of challenge. But we still continue to rely on funding from governments in most of our work.
If I can just add two
Please,
points
yes,
on that.
please.
One, I forgot to mention, I should have. The Twin Cities in Minnesota has, so there's a U.S. attorney there that was tasked to implement a national or a local CV strategy. And when we gave it to him, he said, "Give me the money," and we said, "We don't have no money for you." And so, like a good U.S. attorney, he went around the room and asked for money. So he went to Target Foundation, philanthropic organizations, and collected a not insignificant amount of money for CV, so about $5 million for it. They're doing an interesting experiment, which is unlike any other place in the U.S., which is they're focusing on what they call root causes of it. And I think we can debate whether they actually are root causes, right? But they're building a resiliency system here because it's much more of a larger issue than it would be anywhere else. One last point I think we talked a little bit about, and your question raised it to me. There is a difference between legal tolerance and civil tolerance, right? It is one thing to be a violent guy who likes ISIS. It's another thing to be kind of an Islamist who's, okay with, horrible human rights violations, right? And in the U.S., I think that distinction is the most important thing because the FBI is never going to get into a philosophical or ideological or religious, frankly, debate on the finer points of Scripture. And so you're going to require civil society step into that vacuum because if you don't, others will.
Right. Great. Well said.
We have a question at the end of the table.
Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Stoll. I'm with Georgetown University, and I wanted to kind of pick up, maybe expand a bit on this idea of engagement of civil society. Earlier this week, the American Councils of Education, which is probably the oldest, probably one of the biggest associations for higher ed in the U.S., had its annual conference just a couple blocks away. And the usual, presidential roundtables, provostial roundtables, but I was struck this time by a conversation that was happening kind of on the margins about roughly this sort of thing. How can higher ed somehow engage with or be part of the conversation about addressing some of these issues? And what I was struck by was not only was it happening at this association meeting, it was undertaken by chief diversity officers. So it wasn't, think tanks or research arms of the university. It was the office at the university that was charged with looking at how do you, among other things, expand the reach of education, and how do you, in particular, reach out to these populations in your community that really have had no connection to higher ed. And Seamus, interestingly enough, one of the persons leading this was from the University of Minnesota, and their chief diversity officer, recognizing that the system had to do a lot more to reach out, particularly to the Somali, but other populations. And I'm struck by this confluence of conversations, what we're having now with what was happening there, and I'm wondering if higher ed, at some point, not just as a research arm, but as a means of empowerment, could be part of this conversation.
Maybe I jump in if you
Yeah,
have
then
something
we'll
else.
go to Maqsoud, see if there's any thoughts on it too.
Yeah, I think there's two threads I think I would pull on this. One is universities have slowly dipped their toe in the water. And so you have seen the administration, with some funding from Facebook, implement a peer-to-peer program where about 30 universities are tasked with doing counter-messaging for ISIS. And so your semester-long project would be figure out a counter-messaging program for ISIS. Let's be honest. About 29 of them are atrocious programs. But that's okay, right? You kind of want 1,000 flowers to bloom, and if they're bad, they're bad, and if they're good, you fund them. And so you do see slowly kind of a conversation on this. It's going to be interesting to watch this debate in the U.S. For a number of reasons. One is our numbers are relatively small, so a nationwide program may have kind of a do no harm approach. It's always been my approach for CV, right? That may have a little bit of backlash. The other concern is if you look in the UK, there's been an ongoing debate about the shift away to duty to report. And so you have school teachers who are required under law now to report when they see signs of radicalization. And that has caused a debate on what signs of radicalization looks like, how do you train these officials, what's protected religious thought versus, ideologically inspired, all of those type of things, which we haven't had in this space. You have seen some associations, at least in the middle schools and high schools, have a conversation on the national level about CV. At the university level, nothing of real substance. So I would encourage it. I think it's going to be interesting. And frankly, you get more energy from a 20-something college student than you would, me. And so I'm okay with getting new voices in here.
Well, you're not alone. I mean, don't worry about that. Let me give you examples of very recent work that we have done related to how to empower civil society, community actors, and community engagement initiatives. Just this week, before I arrived to Washington, we had a successful meeting with the UAE Minister of Education, because we're introducing a program, basically a curriculum based on cartoons, the 1001 Arabian Nights, where it has a set of universal civic values, basically how to care about others, to coexist, etc. And we'll be doing a piloting within the UAE on selected schools, and we're hoping to continue to do this in the region. And that's part of the alternative positive messaging that we want. So instead of telling our children what we don't want them to do, we follow more of a sort of a more intelligent psychological approach, asking them to do what we think they should be doing, and looking at that. And this will be part of empowering teachers themselves to be able to share their own skills, to share this kind of storytelling method, to help the students to look into this in a very different way. And within also the UAE context, they just launched last year what they call the moral education, which is their way of basically teaching civic education and related values as means of prevention and also empowerment of the children and the student in order to help them to deal with all the challenges and the issues that they may face. Another initiative, for example, we're working now with an organization called Football for Peace, basically looking at football, sports, as part of the sports diplomacy initiatives, part of the cultural initiatives, part of the arts initiatives, saying that the community can offer always alternative pathways for our children, and also be able to help to resist all the other narrative that is very destructive, that presents itself as the narrative that has all the answers for all the questions, has actually the alternative story, the real story of what's actually happening. In other words, the involvement of the community helps us to move forward, helps us to take the challenge into the next level, and most important, it's about empowering our children, that they can have their level of critical thinking, their ability to deconstruct all the destructive narrative that they see and they actually exposed to, but most importantly, to make the most out of their potential, where we develop their leadership skills, for example, their team work skills, their social skills, and empowering them to the level that they can deal with these issues more constructively and more positively, which is much more sustainable compared to other methods.
Question. We have two up here. Up to you, Bushra, either way.
Hi, I'm Wes Carrington, a retired FSO and public diplomacy officer whose last assignment was at the Global Engagement Center at State. I'd like to thank Seamus for his very charitable comments about the counter-messaging efforts.
You look so rested.
But my question is not about that, but rather more broadly, what should the U.S. government be doing, if anything, in the overseas space? Yeah, there was a comment made that there's not much money for CBE these days. I would say if there is any, it's probably on the Department of Defense side, where they do counter-messaging as well as the more kinetic efforts, as they say. But I'd like to get your thoughts as well, Ambassador, as a former PD officer. What about our traditional public diplomacy toolkits and the things that have been sort of rebranded CVE, but actually we've been doing for a very long time in terms of building the type of resiliency in communities and things like that, and not just State Department, but USAID. Is there a role for those entities to play in countering violent extremism overseas? Thank you.
Sure. You can pass the mic right next to you, I bet. We'll have it on hand here. Anyway, I'll defer to my guests first for your observations on what the U.S. government can be doing effectively with overseas audiences, and I'll pitch in something when I think of it in the end.
Yeah. Let's take the very last question first, which is, what organizations like USAID can do. They did release a joint strategy with Department of State, although I guess you could argue they're part of it, but they released a joint strategy on CVE. State Department has a not insignificant amount of money for CVE. State CT got a big pot of money, a relatively big pot of money from the Hill on this. What they've largely looked at is capacity building for NGOs. For counter messaging itself, well, for USAID, it's just a matter of you look at a hotspot of radicalization, and if you could build a well and insert some counter messaging in that area as opposed to this area, do it in that area. And that's just smart kind of foreign policy, right? For counter messaging, there's going to be, I think there should be a debate on what the outcome should be. So if you're trying to change a person's mind, that is a different approach, and it's probably a much more labor-intensive approach. If you're trying to convince a guy that he shouldn't like Daesh, like there's a different way to do it. If you're just trying to get him so busy and annoyed by you that he can't build a bomb at his house, that is a completely different approach, right? If you just want to troll them, that you set up your system of programming completely different. And one last minute I would note on this is I was very kind to GEC, I think probably because I saw the head of it last night. And there's some level of that. But there is something to be said about better coordination between the white, which is State Department overt communication, the gray, which is DOD with their delayed attribution of we won't tell your DOD until 2 weeks later, and then CIA, and other intelligence organizations that do covert. I'm not convinced that any of those organizations are talking through, especially the covert, in any meaningful way. So if you're counter messaging against, I'll give you a great example. I was giving a presentation to the FBI a few months ago, and I showed a slide of a guy that we had been tracking in our online collection. And one of the guys raised his hand. He goes, Seamus, that's me, right? And so you have to have some level of deconfliction to know that you're not going to be counter messaging against an FBI informant or an intelligence officer or any of those things. Like, we don't run programs, so that's not our problem, but it did save me from having to collect against that account for the next 6 months, right? But we haven't done that in any systematic way right now.
Great, thank you.
Let me approach your comment in a very different way. I belong to a generation who grew up watching ALF. And for those who don't know, ALF is a fantastic alien who landed on Earth, and he was with this sweet American family who took care of him, right? He always wanted to eat their cat, but it's a fantastic story. For me, as a very young boy at the time, that presented a series of set of wonderful values where America is leading on this, where America is the hope, is the alternative, in a very positive way. If ALF, an actual alien, not in the legal sense, but in the actual sense, can actually have refuge in America and be an American, then we all can be American as well. And therefore, Americanism is not the citizenship, but it's the culture, the values, and what comes with it. And in fact, I think this type of thinking and this type of narrative is what is missing at the moment, where the hero is no longer wanting to continue to be the hero and basically turning maybe against or on their own set of values and views as well. At the same time, I think it's important to understand that whether you call it CVE, PVE, public diplomacy, sports diplomacy, all forms of diplomacy, it will take time. We're humans at the end of the day. Things will not just happen by switching on or off any kind of button, but it's a process. And therefore, one of the frustrations that I personally have to deal with in my daily job is wanting to show, for example, results. I mean, we've developed a specific application to measure and evaluate. We called it Masar, and we just launched it at a very sophisticated, GCTF meetings, etc. But as far as I'm concerned, and I'm a psychologist myself, and I'm into psychometrics and evaluation, but I know how wrong we can be because I can't reduce your experience as a human into numbers. We're more than that. At the same time, we know things will take time. I've been trying to lose weight for the last 100 years, and it doesn't happen overnight. I wish I could have a Brad Pitt sort of a six-pack next day. I have one fantastic pack. I'm happy with that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't just change. It will take some time. Having said that, though, I have to also admit, I think what is happening now, we are shifting very quickly into wanting to have new ideas, new things, and not actually perfecting the success stories that we had in the past, and also building on them. Therefore, this fast food diplomacy needs to change, and I think we need to be more stable and more strategic in terms of investing on what we've been very successful with and what we were able to take and move forward with as well.
James, you had another
I
thought?
just want to add one last thing in terms of government counter messaging and alternative messaging. For a long time, the government programming in the region was essentially Islamist light. And there's been a quiet movement at MBM and Al Hora. You see a change in the way they're messaging. They're basically saying, our ratings have been low, it's not working, and by the way, let's promote American values. And so it actually will be interesting to see if ALF comes through kind of in the way that it would in the next year or so. You have a very kind of prominent individual that's running that program, and to see how the region reacts to an almost overt government messaging on these things.
Just from my own experience, I'll offer something. When we were in Yemen, we did in fact get money from DOD for some kind of counter-radicalization, if you will, public diplomacy efforts. And the 2 points I made. First of all, it's my message to my staff was, we need to get our fingerprints off this as fast as possible. This has to look like it's authentically homegrown, generated by community organizations. So find me someone who's willing to take the money quietly and use it in a way that will look like it's made in Yemen and not engineered by anybody else. And we did manage to find small, and Yemen's very rich in that respect. There's a lot of there's an old culture of very small NGOs, mom and pop NGOs, we used to call them. And we could find them and quietly feed them money to put on, amazingly, things like little theater productions that would deliver messages about moderation and tolerance and counter-radicalization. So for me, those were the small little efforts we made that I thought got some traction and had a little bit of success, but it was minor. And Maqsoud is right. This is a marathon. And right next door, you have a question.
Hi, how's it going? My name is Jake Shapiro. I'm at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. We're a small NGO that does peace building and reconciliation, working both with religious and secular community groups. You guys mentioned, more than a few times how we need to partner with communities, how we need to engage with the leaders. And this is something we've done, engaging with religious leaders to spread counter-narratives. We partnered with over 1,000 madrasas in Pakistan to promote counter-narratives, and we just came out with reports on doing so in Yemen, Tunisia, and Morocco. The question that rises for us is, when we engage with religious actors, do we give them legitimacy that they didn't already have in negative ways? Do we uplift people who could be causing harm? And as the U.S. government, how can the government support and engage with these people when we have very specific limitations, both in the separation of church and state and politically and culturally in engaging with these types of people? Thanks.
If I may.
Please.
Excellent question and a very complicated one, and I'll try to approach it from three major angles. Number one, the debate over the separation of church and state, mosque and state, synagogue and state, etc., when it comes to religious affairs. But religion has another aspect, especially, let's say, with religious leaders. They're actually community leaders. That's why when we were approached, for example, to train Afghani imams, we did not train them because they were imams, but because they were actually community leaders. And in that sense, they engage with the wider community. Therefore, from that perspective, obviously they exist, they have influence, they have their own constituency, and they have their own base. And all of that is part of the ongoing interaction with the community. Without the need to go into the very specific debate over the nature of their scripture or religious beliefs and what it actually means. The second reflection is by looking at the realities. You need to empower those who can actually influence. For example, the Council of Muslim Elders will be hosting in May a very interesting meeting where they are inviting Muslim minorities, community leaders from around the world, to basically communicate with them a simple message. The Muslim leaders of the Islamic world are telling you, you're first a citizen of your country and then a Muslim. Khilafah as a concept is a myth, is not necessarily Islamic. It's part of the history, but mainstream Islamic scholarly discourse is supporting basically the consistency between your citizenship and your own individual belief, and there should be no contradictions in that sort of case. If we don't engage at that level of conversation, empowering these kind of voices, this kind of moderate religious voices, we will continue to be in this sort of cycle. The final point, and it's a very personal reflection that I believe, and especially within the Islamic context. You see, over the last 100 years, there was this ongoing debate, post-colonial era in the region, the question of identity, who are we? Now that the colonial forces went out, we are now independent. Which path should we take? Should we go into more secular traditions or more of an Islamist traditions, and what it all actually means? I argue that this debate is still ongoing, it's inconclusive, and it's part of the identity crisis that the region collectively has on which direction they should take. That's why groups such as Daesh, Al-Qaeda, they come to represent and present themselves as this alternative, that they have this simple, direct solution. With the absence of any serious alternative, makes this debate ongoing. Having said that, though, the real question from my personal perspective is this. This debate will continue. You'll have people who will tell you God does not exist, all the way till people say God actually exists. And even those who believe in God, they will tell you there are different gods. And those who don't believe in God, they'll have different variation and explanations. And this is an ongoing debate that will never end, in my opinion. The real challenge is not that we have an answer for these debates because we won't, but how we can create an environment that will enable those who can agree and disagree to continue to have that dialogue and not to end up with a situation that we have today in the region. Because I disagree with you, I give myself the right to eliminate you. Because you are not part of Daesh, you're not part of Al-Qaeda, therefore you should die. And you'll see this kind of dynamic happening. Therefore, for us to continue to have this healthy conversation between people of faith, between secular institutions, civic society, all representations of the society, you will need to have certain platforms to allow this to happen. And we can utilize all of these roles, and we can maybe have variations of how we can include religious discourse in this without necessarily having a debate on scripture, but rather on influence and leadership within the community.
If I may just add, it's been interesting to watch the UK go through a bunch of iterations of its PREVENT program. Early on, you had engagement with interlocutors or folks like that. When David Cameron came in, took a review and basically pulled away from, I guess, traditionally Equani networks in the UK and wanted to promote British values. And now you have a weird in-between happening in the UK. In the US, there's not that level of nuance, frankly. My general view on this has always been, engage but don't embrace. There's a way to do this right. And if you have a young man you're worried about in Boston, you may reach out to a religious leader whose views are concerning at any other point. But to get that kid to not jump on a plane, you may have to decide to team up with that individual. But maybe you don't do it on the front page of the Boston Globe, right? And so it's doing it a little bit smarter than I think we've done it in the past.
Well, I want to thank everyone, especially our guests, for having such a wonderful discussion with us. I think they'll stick around for a few minutes. If you have any further questions, you can come on up here and talk to them personally about that. Maqsoud Kruse, Seamus Hughes, thank you all very much for joining us. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you.